Hello everyone, this is Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. Gonna compare these two, kind of share some memories of the game. So first thing, I am playing the Super Famicom version of Street Fighter 2 because that's just the one that I have. So we got live gameplay on the right on Super Nintendo. Genesis gameplay on the left that was recorded earlier. So both, might as well get this out of the way in terms of which game is better, whether it's Super Nintendo version or Genesis version. They are both so even and close to call that I don't consider anyone better than the other. I was always a fan of the Super Nintendo version over the Genesis version because I grew up a Super Nintendo fanboy, but looking back on it, and I still kind of consider the Super Nintendo version better just because of that, but looking back on it and looking at the games now, they are so close and they are so identical. If you think the Genesis version is better or if you think Super Nintendo version is better, you're right, either way. So they are both absolutely fantastic. We'll compare some sound a little bit. Oops. There we go. Trying to get the icons correct. So both games have really good music and sound effects. Genesis sound effects, the voice samples and stuff are a little scratchy, but still really good, still accurate to the arcade. Even though the Super Nintendo is usually more superior in terms of the music, it's still really good on the Sega Genesis, especially considering the Genesis Yamaha sound chip that's on there. And if you get a good composer back in the day that knew what they were doing on it, especially with later development tools, Genesis music was still really, really good. It was very different to what the Super Nintendo used, because it would actually use actual music samples and then would change the pitch to simulate notes. Dalsum is kicking my butt. It's okay. There we go. So when this game came out on Super Nintendo, the first version, the World Warrior, it was probably the first game to really show how good an arcade port could be on the 16-bit, in the 16-bit era. Because before that, you had Final Fight and Pit Fighter. Pit Fighter was just a horrible game on Super Nintendo. Final Fight on Super Nintendo wasn't too bad, but it was missing the two-player option. It was a little limited compared to its arcade counterpart. Where this Street Fighter 2, the World Warrior on Super Nintendo, didn't really cut anything out. It maybe cut out some graphic stuff a little bit, like some characters in the background, but other than that, it was identical gameplay and almost graphics-wise. I used to go to the arcade in the pizza place all the time in the 7th grade to play Street Fighter 2 and meet up some friends or go there together. And then when it came out on Super Nintendo, I couldn't buy it right away because I didn't have the money, but my local Fred Meyer had a Super Nintendo display kiosk, and they had put Street Fighter 2 on there. So like for about 3 weeks, instead of going to the arcade, I would just go there and play it for free. So that was kind of cool. The only problem is a lot of the employees that worked at Fred Meyer were hogging the machine more than the customers. So this is a game where the Genesis 6-button controller layout is really takes advantage. Or the layout really, the game really takes advantage of the layout. In fact, the controller was really built for this game. If it wasn't for Street Fighter 2 coming out on the Sega Genesis, there probably wouldn't be a 6-button controller released on the Sega Genesis. That's probably the major drawback back in the day of the Genesis version, is you had to buy an extra controller to really take advantage of the game. But it was still good. And the Genesis version of Street Fighter 2 really showed that the Genesis hardware could keep up with the Super Nintendo, despite almost every other, with the exception of the CPU, just about every other technical limitation in comparison.
You win. Round 2, fight. Hadouken! Hadouken! Hadouken!
And both these games I'm using original hardware. They are upscaled through the Framemeister using RGB cables. And I got them, I should have them scaled perfectly. So you should have a very accurate comparison here. Using a one-chip Super Nintendo. Highly recommend getting a one-chip Super Nintendo if you're really into playing really good quality on original hardware. And Super Nintendo does support S-Video. I don't remember if I mentioned that in my Mortal Kombat video or not. But Super Nintendo did support S-Video native output. Except for that junior model, that second model that came out. That did not. Sega Genesis does not support S-Video output, but it does support RGB and SCART. And in fact, the quality of the SCART RGB signal out of the Genesis is really good. Probably superior to the Super Nintendo when you look at it really close. I'll switch the sound here so you guys can get a kind of a comparison. Guile's always a challenge for me in this game. Not doing too bad against them. So a friend of mine back in junior high school named Scott, we every once in a while, the pizza place that had a Street Fighter 2 machine was right down the road from our junior high school. So it was a couple times in the spring where we would walk down to the pizza place after school, and then one of our moms would pick us up after an hour. But one day there was these college kids hanging out playing the game, and we were only in 7th grade, and I decided to play against them. And my friend Scott was afraid that we were going to get beat up or something if we beat them, and luckily we didn't. But put in a quarter, beat the first kid, not really a kid. Beat the first guy. Second guy walks up and goes, "Oh, don't worry, I'll beat him." He walks up, puts his quarter in, and I beat him. Then the third guy goes, "Oh, don't worry, guys, I'll get him." And then I beat him. And then the first guy goes back up and goes, "I want revenge." And I beat him. These 3 college kids were getting passes. Junior high kid was kicking their ass with Ryu. And the funny thing about that version, that particular arcade cabinet, the buttons, instead of three rows of buttons from left and right, they were actually up and down. Whoever built that cabinet built it wrong for whatever reason. It was fine once you got used to it. Yeah, Genesis music on this game is still pretty good. And I believe that Genesis has a higher native resolution a little bit, so that's why the Genesis version actually looks a little bit wider and bigger screen. Of course, Ryu was always my favorite character back in the arcade. Some of the later Street Fighter games, I like playing Ken better. And both these games have Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition and Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting. I mean, Super Nintendo version is labeled as Turbo Hyper Fighting, and the Genesis version is labeled as Champion Edition. But they're both essentially the same game. They have both. The differences include like some of the gameplay speed, some extra moves like Chun-Li's Fireball or Dhalsim's Teleport, or Ken and Ryu doing the Hurricane Kick in the air. And the only difference with Champion Edition in terms of these two games and Champion Edition with the arcade games is in the arcade, when they went from Champion Edition to Hyper Fighting, they did some balance fixes. Like a good example would be M. Bison. When he blocked the Flaming Torpedo, the Psycho Crusher move, it'll hit him 6 times blocked. Where in Turbo, it only hits him 3 times. Well, both of these versions, it'll still hit him 3 times even in Champion Edition. So some of those balance fixes are in the game in both versions. And I think Vega still does that rolling claw thing, where in Turbo Hyper Fighting they added like a thing where he rolls 3 times and does it. And in Super Nintendo, and I believe the Genesis version as well, the Champion Edition game has that as well. Kind of a little oversight they missed. But still really good. I missed a barrel. Of course, because I'm playing the Japanese version on Super Nintendo, the boss names are different. In the Japanese version, M. Bison was originally named Vega, Vega was originally named Balrog, and Balrog was originally named M. Bison. Supposedly they changed that because of the likeness to Mike Tyson. Just about everyone knows that now. But in case you didn't, got him in a good combo there. I believe I read recently that they're re-releasing Street Fighter II: The World Warrior on Super Nintendo, like an official game that Capcom's doing. It's kind of cool. Hopefully it's a good quality board. Apparently there's some concern about the cartridge setting the system on fire or some some BS thing like that. Starting to see that with a lot of games now. I think like Joe and Mac, Data East, I think they're re-releasing games on official hardware. That's kind of cool. I'm hoping to see more indie games developed for 16-bit hardware, which I guess development tools really aren't there yet, and then hopefully they will be someday. Probably Genesis before Super Nintendo. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. There we go. Like, I picked up that fighting game, Unholy Knight. Supposedly it was made by old Neo Geo developers or something. Great graphics. Great cover art. Horrible game. It's really a collector's item and nothing more. Yeah, both versions of this game have excellent graphics that hold up to the arcade. I never played the TurboGrafx 16 version of the game. I think it was released only in Japan. I don't know if it was CD based or that card game, that card format, but I played it on the Wii, like the Virtual Console version, and it surprisingly holds up very well to these two. One funny thing that they didn't port over to the game for some reason was that little intro where it shows the two guys fighting in the street on the Super Nintendo. I guess Nintendo's standard practices didn't even like that. Of course, this game came out before Mortal Kombat, so it came out before that the whole blood thing. M. Bison was giving me some trouble when I was playing this earlier. I think it took me 3 tries to beat him, so I was a little out of practice. If I remember correctly, I don't know if this is on the Genesis version, but the Super Nintendo version, if you play on the hardest difficulty and you beat every character without continuing, it has like a little portrait pose of all the characters in the background, with the exception of the bosses. But if you beat the game without losing a single round, it has like the ending has like a cool portrait of all the characters in the background, including the bosses. Took me a lot of practice back in the day to do that. I always wish a lot of these games had battery backups to save the scores. Not really feasible because of the cost. And you didn't have memory cards or anything back then. There we go. I got lucky on that combo right there. Looked really cool though. That combo is actually easier. The combos with the Dragon Punch at the end are actually a little easier to pull off with Ken, because in all the Street Fighter games after the World Warrior, Ken's Dragon Punch actually moves forward a little bit more. So it's a little easier to hit him. So yeah, that is Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition and Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting on both the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. Like I said earlier, I always liked the Super Nintendo version better because that was my system of choice back then. So I'm curious to hear which one was your favorite and which system was your preference. So feel free to leave a comment down below, and hopefully don't ignite an old console war too much. And see you guys later.